Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Both good morning to those in the hearing room and those who are following us online. We're about to resume our hearing in relation to the Royal Hospital for Children and Young Persons. And again, asking the questions will be Deputy Counsel to the inquiry, John McGregor, who is assisted by one of the solicitors to the inquiry, Kira Dargy. I'm assisted by Ingrid Nolan, who is another of the assistant solicitors inquiry. Now, Mr. McGregor, we have a witness.
We do. The next witness would be Janice MacKenzie.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. MacKenzie.
Morning.
Now, as you understand, you've been with us before.
I have.
As you understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. McGregor on the right. But first, you're willing, I think, to take the oath.
Yes.
Sitting where you are, I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That I will tell the truth.
that I will tell the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Ms. MacKenzie. Now, if only for me, because my hearing is, probably heard me say this before, my hearing is not what it was. And I'm anxious to hear your answers. So if I can ask you maybe to speak, you should get assistance from the microphone, but maybe just a little louder than you would speak normally, and possibly just a little slower. It's not easy, but as I say, my hearing is not what it was. Now, Mr. McGregor.
Thank you. You are Janice MacKenzie, is that right?
It is.
And you've provided a witness statement to the inquiry for this set of hearings, which you should have a copy available to you if you require it.
Yes.
For anyone following in the electronic bundles, it's in bundle 13, beginning at page 187. The content of that statement is going to form part of your evidence to the inquiry. You're also going to be asked questions today. If at any point you want to refer to your statement, please do just let me know. In relation to your career, you tell us within your statement at paragraph 2 that you're retired, but you were previously the project clinical director with Lothian Health Board. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And in relation to your career and background, you'd already set that out in a previous witness statement that you provided the inquiry, and also in the oral evidence that you gave in the hearings in May 2022.
Yes.
So in terms of today, I'd simply take all of that background as read and move on to ask you some questions about the procurement exercise and the period to conclusion of the contract in the project involving the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People. Am I right in thinking that you become involved in the project really at the point that there's the switch that's taking place from the original capital project to the project that's then going to be revenue funded?
Yes, directly involved in the project. I started on the project in April 2011.
And before that, perhaps some limited input in your clinical capacity, but really in terms of being fully engaged in the project, it's at this point in 2011 that you're coming on board.
That's correct.
Thank you. You explain at paragraph 9 of your statement, it might just be worth bringing that up. So within bundle 13, It's at page 189, and it would be paragraph 9. See the paragraph beginning, when the switch to NPD.
Yes.
And you tell us when the switch to NPD was announced, the design for the RHS standalone hospital was at a relatively advanced stage. Following the switch to an NPD-funded model, there was continued engagement with the clinicians, i.e. user groups, try and utilise and continue the design work undertaken to date. This is around the point which I became directly involved. You see that?
Yes.
So could you just explain your understanding of how much design work has taken place and what clinical input has there been into that design?
So by that time, the departmental adjacencies had been agreed, and adjacencies within departments. So the 1 in 5, what we refer to as the 1 in 500 drawings, which are departmental adjacencies by floor, and then the 1 in 200s, which are the room adjacencies. And we were about to start on 1 in 50 detailed design of rooms. And the clinicians had attended design meetings with the architects to plan out what was required from their perspective.
But at this point, in terms of the input from clinicians, mainly input in relation to the architects in terms of the design, rooms, adjacencies, those types of issues, is that correct?
Yes.
Were you aware at this point that there had been a draft environmental matrix prepared by engineers?
I don't know if exactly at that point I was. I certainly at some point on joining the project fairly early on, I was aware that there was a draft environmental matrix.
And at this point you tell us that understandably NHS Lothian didn't want to waste work that had been done. And is that in terms of the work both done in terms of the design, so sums paid to outside contractors that worked on the project?
I think that, yes, but I think from my perspective, it was the work that the clinicians had given. I mean, as you'll appreciate, clinicians are very busy people, and they had given up a lot of their time, and that the design from their perspective wasn't going to change just because the funding model was changing.
So whenever you're talking about not wanting to waste the work that's been done, perhaps two issues as I understand you. Firstly, there's the work that's been done by the outside professionals, the architects, the engineers, but also there's the internal work, the time taken up by clinicians who would otherwise be doing their day job of dealing with treating people that need to come into hospital.
Yeah, yes.
That's entirely understandable that a body that has done that work wouldn't want to waste that work. Was there an assessment at this point of whether that work on the capital phase was going to be appropriate for a revenue-funded project?
I think from a clinical design point of view, it would make no difference between a capital funded or a revenue funded project, because the care that was required to be delivered to children and their families wasn't going to change. So therefore the facilities that were required weren't going to change.
So from a clinical perspective, the second aspect of the work, you really didn't see that there was going to be any differences at all?
No.
What about in relation to the work that had been done by the professionals, so the architects, the engineers? Was there any consideration given by the project team to whether that work could simply be taken and built upon in the revenue funded model?
I don't know that there was any formal assessment, but certainly there was discussions about the relevance of work that had been undertaken.
And are you able to kind of give us any more detail in terms of those discussions? Are those internal discussions, or is NHS Lothian engaging with other bodies and entities to discuss those issues?
I don't recall exactly what the discussions were.
You don't recall the discussions, don't recall who's involved?
I don't recall specifics of discussions and who was involved.
Thank you. The reason I raised the issue is that there's certain other witnesses that have given evidence to the inquiry and provided witness statements that have suggested that issues like the environmental matrix may have been very helpful on a capital project, but perhaps less helpful on a revenue-funded project. Do you remember any discussions around about those issues?
No, I wasn't really involved in discussions about the environmental project.
Did you understand why it had been produced at all, or was that really an issue for other people?
I think on the whole it was an issue for other people. I understood it was there, and I understood that it had information in it from a technical perspective, but it wasn't something that I was looking at.
But in terms of whether that would be a helpful document, something that could give rise to confusion, is that all out with your sphere of expertise?
Yes, I wouldn't have the expertise to make a comment on that.
Thank you. The next issue that I'd like to ask you about is just to try and understand the clinical input that's being provided to the engineers as they go about undertaking their task. So if I could ask you to look at your witness statement at paragraph 12, I think pick these matters up. So that'd be on page 189 of bundle 13. You tell us the clinicians' input at meetings would include explaining the requirements of their department, particularly what accommodation they required. They would provide information around specific rooms, what they were used for. For example, clinicians would explain what activities would be happening in a specific room and the equipment required so that the architects and other advisors could plan accordingly. The architects could also explain their proposals to the clinicians, seek to ensure that spaces were designed appropriately. Various design changes were discussed during these meetings, subsequently cast the next revised set of drawings, which were then issued for further review. You see that?
Yes.
Now, you tell us within your statement that you don't recall there being any specific discussions taking place with Hulley and Kirkwood, who were the mechanical and electrical engineers. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Can you just shed some light on why weren't there discussions between the clinicians and Hulley and Kirkwood?
As far as I was aware, as such, the clinicians wouldn't have been in a position to know the kind of mechanical engineering type of information that would be required. They would be relying upon experts in that field to provide that. So they would respond to specific questions if the M&E engineers had questions about activities happening in a room, but they wouldn't have the knowledge to comment on whether or not those were correct or not.
Because I think one thing I'd raise with you for comment is we've obviously heard from the engineering side from Hulley and Kirkwood, and they almost put the counterpoint to that, which is to say, well, I'm an engineer, I'm not a clinician, so I can do the technical, mechanical and electrical engineering, but I can't provide the kind of clinical input into how a space would be used in a room. Do you see it as potentially problematic that there wasn't a direct discussion between clinicians and the engineers on the project?
I think the information that was required around activities happening in particular rooms was provided. It was there. It was there initially in what we called design briefs that then developed into clinical output specifications. So the information was there for engineers to look at, and if they had any queries, then they would come back to us. And certainly, as I became more involved in the project, there were queries came back from engineers about, you know, some of the more technical aspects of the project that they wanted clarity on in relation to the clinical activities that would be happening in a room.
So how did that flow of information take place? If you've got the clinicians on one hand, and you've got the engineers, Hulley and Kirkwood, and they're not speaking directly to each other, how does information flow between the two parties?
So in relation to Hulley and Kirkwood, then I say I wasn't directly involved really with them at that time, but my understanding would have been that would have been directed through the project team, through one of the capital project managers or one of the other project managers, and then they would, if they didn't know the answer, they would then discuss it with the clinicians and then would feed back to the engineers.
Is that a direct line of communication between in Kirkwood and people in the NHS, or are other entities such as Davis Langdon, Mott MacDonald, are they involved in the community?
Yes,
channel
they
of
would
communication?
be involved in the communication, yes.
You've obviously said in your evidence that you don't think there would have been any point in clinicians looking at something like an environmental matrix. Just as a matter of clarity, do you know whether the environmental matrix in draft form or final form was ever provided to clinicians at all?
As far as I can recall, it was never provided to.
And again, you've explained why you don't think that would have been a good idea. One other issue that I'd just like to ask you about is the inquiry's heard evidence in relation to the development of technical guidance for ventilation systems in a hospital. So if you go back prior to 2011, there was really no guidance in terms of air change rates or the like. But from 2011 onwards, there was developing guidance, perhaps heard about Scottish Health Technical Memorandum 0301 for Scotland and Health Technical Memorandum 0301 in England. Whenever that type of guidance was coming in, it's technical guidance in relation to engineering requirements, but is that something that would have been on the radar of clinicians and people working in infection prevention and control?
I don't think it necessarily would have been something that clinicians would have been aware of or would have thought it was appropriate for them to look at. I think, yes, infection prevention control would certainly have an awareness of any new guidance that was coming out.
The next issue that I'd wish to ask you about is the clinical output specifications, which you address in your statement. Could you just explain to the inquiry what were the clinical output specifications?
So there was a clinical output specification for every department in the hospital, and in that it explained what the function of that department was, the types of patients that would be there, the activity levels. It then went on to explain the main activities that would be happening in each of the rooms within the department, any specific requirements from a clinical perspective that were kind of different from being kind of standard requirements. It also made reference to technical documents that the designers should be aware of and be following.
In very simple terms, would this effectively become the client brief that would go out to tenderers?
Yes.
If I can ask you to look within your statement at page 191 of bundle 13, at paragraph 19, just at the very bottom of page 191, you see the final sentence beginning that the COS became.
Yeah.
You tell the inquiry that the COS became one of the key documents in IT Volume 3 and provided the preferred bidders with the detailed requirements, functions of each of the clinical departments. See that?
Yes.
Now, also included in the IT, within the board's construction requirements, as they came to be called, was the environmental matrix. Were you aware of that?
I was aware that, yes, it was part of the board construction requirements, yes.
And again, that there seems to be a controversy between core participants participating in the inquiry in relation to the status of that document. So in terms of the board's construction requirements and the environmental matrix that was included as an appendix, there seems to be two schools of thought. On the one hand, it was a mandatory brief that set out absolute requirements that had to be followed by tenderers, but there's a differing view, because it was just really provided as a guide, but it couldn't be relied upon at all by tenderers. What was your understanding of the intention of the document?
My understanding was that it was a draft. It was at a point in time when we went out to tender, and that it would continue to be developed as the design developed, as many of the the documents that were provided, they changed the reference design no longer. Once the bidders were appointed, they developed that and it became their design.
Were you aware that within ITPD that room data sheets weren't provided, that they hadn't been produced by NHS Lothian or its advisors?
I was aware that, yes, they had provided.
Can you recall why that decision was taken not to produce room data sheets?
No, I don't recall. I wasn't involved in any discussions about that.
Because again, you may not be able to help, but one issue that the inquiry is interested to try to explore is whether really the environmental matrix came to be a brief instead of the room data sheet. So are you able to shed any light on that issue?
The only thing that I'm aware of is that the environmental matrix contained some information that would be in room data sheets.
And in relation to reviewing what you call the clinical output specification that comes to be included in the ITP, obviously you've talked about the internal work that takes place on the part of NHS Lothian. What advice, if any, is NHS Lothian getting from external advisors?
So the clinical output specifications, the template that we used was reviewed by Capita, who were healthcare planners at the time, and also Mott MacDonald reviewed them as well.
And you've mentioned Mott MacDonald. Perhaps if we just explore that a little, who are Mott MacDonald and what was their role in the project?
The Mott MacDonald were our technical advisors and also helping with project management aspects.
And what about when it came to the assessment of tenders? Were Mott MacDonald involved at that stage?
Yes, they were involved, yes.
And what were they doing at that stage?
They were assisting us with evaluating the tenders.
Again, if we just look to your witness statement, which is in bundle 13, and look to paragraph 22, tells, from my perspective, the review of the COS by Mott's included ensuring that the correct design guidance was stated, including in relation to mechanical and electrical engineering. Mott's role would have been to ensure the relevant guidance set out in section 9 of the COS. Is that?
Yes.
So that's your understanding of what Mott MacDonald's role would have been in terms of the production and reviewing of the documentation that goes out to tenderers?
Yes.
Thank you. If I can ask you to then look on to page 195, paragraph 34, the final sentence there, state they, this is referring to Mott MacDonald, they were our technical advisors who could and did advise on all technical issues. Could you just explain what do you mean by that, advising on all technical issues?
I suppose anything that was related to mechanical engineering or architectural, they were providing advice to us around whether or not drawings or proposals from their perspective were meeting our brief.
Mott MacDonald's role has been described by another witness, provided a witness statement to the inquiry, as being akin to that of a shadow design team. Would you agree with that assessment of the role of Mott MacDonald effectively being a shadow design team?
Not sure that I would. I don't think they were there to design the new hospital. They were there to provide us with advice, but no, it's not something I would recognise their role as.
Thank you. Now, in relation to Mott MacDonald's role in the review of tenders, the inquiry's got witness statements that have been provided on behalf of Mott MacDonald, whereby their view is that what they were doing at that stage is they weren't conducting a forensic audit of tenders that had been submitted. They weren't conducting a line-by-line review of environmental matrices provided by prospective tenderers. Was that your understanding of the relatively limited role that Mott MacDonald would have?
I don't know that I would necessarily be aware of the kind of level of scrutiny that they were providing. I think, as far as I was concerned, and certainly my interactions with them were that they were providing a lot of scrutiny and review, but I was predominantly obviously involved in the more architectural aspects of the design, and certainly my main contact in Mott's attended all the design meetings and was very helpful at those meetings.
And did they provide any assurances before a preferred bidder was appointed, perhaps to the Finance and Performance Review Committee?
I didn't attend those meetings, so I'm not sure.
Well, I appreciate it's a long time
Yeah.
ago, so perhaps if we turn the minutes up, that might be more productive. If I could ask you to look within bundle 10, please, volume 1, and to go to page 5. This is minutes of a Finance and Resources Committee of NHS Lothian of the 5th of March 2015. Do you
Yes,
see that?
yes.
And in attendance, in the final line of the attendees, that you were an attendee.
I was
I
at that.
appreciate this is
Yes.
nearly 10 years ago now, so it's perhaps more helpful to go through the minutes
Yeah.
than to ask you general questions. You see at paragraph 61, the bold heading, Royal Hospital for Sick Children and Department of Clinical Neurosciences, Little France, project procurement and recommendation of preferred bidder. 61.1, the committee received a previously circulated report confirming completion of the evaluation of final tenders for the Royal Hospital for Sick Children and Department of Clinical Neurosciences at Little France. Do you see that?
Yes.
So at this point, you're getting to the point that documents have been issued to bidders, bids have come in, assessments have taken place, and there's now a consideration by this committee of what's coming. Look at 61.4, this is a point I'll come back to, but just so we don't have to jump backwards and forwards in documents. The committee noted that the Scottish Futures Trust required that 60% of the evaluation of final tenders had to relate to commercial stroke cost, and that 40% of the evaluation had to relate to quality. Do you see that?
I do.
Just in relation to that 60-40 split, was that something that NHS Lothian was completely comfortable with?
My recollection is that no, we weren't comfortable with it. Obviously, this was the first project that I had been involved in, but I recall that in being told that in previous capital funded projects, it was the other way around. So 60% was for quality and 40% with finance, and that was what NHS Lothian would have preferred.
So they would have preferred the 60-40 split, but the other way around?
Yes.
We can come on to it, but I think in your witness statement you described that as being imposed on NHS Lothian. Is that a fair assessment of your view?
That's certainly my recollection of yes, what was happening. I mean, I wasn't involved in discussions with SFT about that, but certainly that was what we were told.
Because, again, just to be fair, the inquiry might hear evidence from witnesses from the Scottish Futures Trust to say 60-40 split in terms of price and quality was standard, but it could have been departed from if there was that. So, yes, it was standard, but it wasn't actually imposed by Scottish Futures Trust. Do you have any assistance you can provide the inquiry on that issue?
No, I don't. I say I wasn't involved in the discussions, so.
Thank you. So if we could return to the minutes, we're still within Bundle 10, Volume 1, page 5. And if we could move on to page 6, look at paragraph 61.10. The minutes record Mr. Cantley, representing Mott MacDonald, advised the committee, technical advisors for the re-provision of the Royal Hospital for Sick Children and Department of Clinical Neurosciences at Little France NPT project. He believed from a technical perspective that the technical evaluation carried out in a manner consistent with the evaluation methodology. From their involvement in this process, the considered scores awarded for the technical evaluation criteria seemed to be correct, it appeared appropriate for the board to conclude the evaluation process and appoint the bidder identified having the most economically advantageous tender as the preferred bidder. Do you see that?
Yes.
Having refreshed your memory in the minutes, do you remember that statement being made by Mr. Cantley?
I don't specifically remember it, no.
And do you remember the way, if any, that was accorded by the board to the statements made by Mr.
No, I don't.
We move on to page 7. Paragraph 61.16. Mr. Curry confirmed that all 3 bids had acceptable quality. That?
Yes.
And then perhaps just reading short to the last 3 lines, final full sentence. Everything possible had been done to mitigate the risk of poor quality facilities and or poor services provided to NHS Lothian. See that?
Yes.
Do you have any recollection of that type of discussion taking place around about this time?
I do now recall attending the meeting. I say I wouldn't normally attend those meetings. From my recollection, the reason for my attendance at that meeting was in case any of the Finance and Resource Committee had questions about anything clinical in relation to the tenders, but I don't recall the detail of the meeting.
And just the final couple of sections to look at, paragraph 61.20, that's on page 7. You see the paragraph at the bottom beginning, Mr. Cantley confirmed.
Yes.
Mr. Cantley confirmed that the scores were all appropriate, happy with the evaluation, and satisfied that the preferred bidder was in full accordance with the requirements. See that?
Yes.
Then over the page 8, paragraph 61.23, we see the resolutions that are made by the committee. The committee agreed to note the outcome of the board evaluation and the assurance statements by legal, technical and financial advisors, along with the completion of the key stage review, appointment of bidder by the Scottish Future Trust. The committee agreed unanimously, with no dissent from any members present, to approve the recommended project team as endorsed by the project's board, appoint Integrated Health Solutions Lothian as the preferred bidder for the development of the Royal Hospital for Sick Children and Department of Clinical Neurosciences on the site at Little France, authorise the project director to issue the formal preferred bidder letter to associated unsuccessful bidder letters in order to formally commence the contract standstill period required under the relevant procurement regulation. See that?
Yes.
It seems from the terms of this minute that effectively the committee is being told that there's been an assessment of tenders, everything's in accordance with the evaluation, and that there's a recommendation that a preferred bidder should be appointed. There doesn't seem to be any concerns that are being raised by any parties. Is that your understanding of the position at that time?
At that time, yes.
Were you involved at all in the assessment of the tenders that were submitted for the project?
I was involved, yes. I was part of the core evaluation team.
You tell us within your statement that you weren't involved in the mechanical and electrical engineering assessment, but can you just explain to us what were you doing? How were tenders being assessed? How were they being scrutinised? Scored as having a pass or fail, and then if they got through that, being awarded specific scores for the aspects you were involved in?
So for the aspects that I was involved in, they were, we reviewed the tenders. So myself, Fiona Halcrow, who was one of the project managers, James Steers, who was the clinical lead for Department of Clinical Neurosciences, Infection Prevention Control also reviewed specific elements as well. So we would review them, and then we individually scored, then came together and developed a consensus score.
If we perhaps just take it in stages, as I understand it, there's 2 levels to the assessment. There's certain criteria that are pass-fail, is that correct?
Yes.
And then if you get through all of that as a tenderer, there's then almost a second exercise whereby specific scores are awarded for various criteria.
Yes, I mean, some of the criteria were just scored, they weren't a pass-fail, so, and most of the aspects that I was involved in were scored. They weren't a pass-fail criteria.
Did you have any involvement in any pass-fail criteria?
I might have done in the strategic and management, but I don't recall.
Because again, you might not be able to assist the inquiry, but one issue that the inquiry is interested in is intensity of review in relation to pass-fail issues. So there's a number of issues within the criteria whereby a tenderer would be asked to do certain things. And the tenderer might say, I'm going to do that, and then provide a solution. Can you shed any light on the intensity of review that would be undertaken for solutions put forward by tenderers?
No, because I wasn't involved in those. No.
Now, you tell us in your statement you're not involved in the mechanical and electrical engineering side of assessment, but presumably there's a point whereby everyone involved in the assessment comes together to share knowledge, have a discussion, draw matters together.
Yes, we did, yes.
Within the context of those types of meetings, how significant would a concern have to be for one side of the assessment team to raise it with another side of the assessment team? So, for example, the issues you're dealing with, how significant would an issue have to be for you to feel you wanted to share it with other people involved in the team?
So I suppose the things that I would be looking at would be, I would view as being significant if the bidder had deviated completely from the reference design, so all of the clinical adjacencies were not as in the reference design. So I would raise that, and that did happen by one bidder.
That's the type of high level issue that you would be raising internally with other members. Now, one issue that the inquiry is going to explore is the environmental matrices that were submitted by various tenderers. So that's a specific aspect of mechanical and electrical engineering. One tenderer simply says the draft that was included with the ITPD, they'll comply with those values. Another tenderer changed a number of values, marked them up in red within that document. Do you remember there being any discussion at a project level in relation to that issue?
I don't know.
Is that the type of issue that you would have expected to be raised with you by other members of the project team?
I suppose the honest answer is I don't know, because it would depend how significant potentially those changes were. I don't know.
Another issue that I'd want to move on and ask you about is production of room data sheet. Am I correct in thinking that by financial close, the party that was appointed as preferred bidder had to provide 100% room data sheets, so a room data sheet for every room in the hospital?
Yes, that was my understanding.
Yes. So perhaps if we just look to that requirement, if I could ask you to have bundle 2 in front of you, please, at page 965. We're within the invitation to participate in dialogue, and you see the bold heading 2.5.3 room data sheets.
Yes.
And just below the various bullet points, there's a paragraph beginning during dialogue.
Yes.
It says, during dialogue, bidders will be required to develop room data incorporating the room information for those rooms for which 1 to 50 layout drawings have been prepared. For the avoidance of doubt, this shall include all key rooms, generic rooms, in addition to those rooms identified in the table at paragraph 2.5.2 above. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So that's what had to be submitted as part of your tender. And then it continues, the room data sheet will form part of the bidder's proposals. The preferred bidder will be required to complete room data sheet for all remaining rooms prior to financial close. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, at this stage, you're involved in the assessment process. If, as part of their tender, a tenderer had submitted a bid that said, going to provide you with some room data sheets, but I'm telling you now, I won't produce all room data sheets by financial close, what would have happened to that tender?
I think there would have been discussion about that, and it would be pointed out to the bidder that that was a requirement.
Would a bid of the nature that I've put to you, would that not be a variant bid that should be rejected?
I would have thought so, yes.
I just want to be clear on what your position is. If a tenderer submitted a tender that said, I see there is a requirement in the procurement document for me to produce all room data sheets by financial close, but I am not going to do that, what do you think the board would have done?
I mean, I think it's difficult to say. From my perspective, I think we would have said that's not acceptable, and therefore we're not. You would fail the process.
Thank you. The inquiry's heard evidence that IHSL gets a third bidder, but by financial close, 100% room data sheets were not provided. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
Why did that happen?
As far as I can recall, it happened because IHSL felt that there wasn't sufficient time for them to complete them all, and that the information that was contained within the room data sheets was in other documents, and that they had provided ones for the key and generic room.
And why did NHS Lothian agree to that position?
I think it was a pragmatic decision because we had got this far, and that we needed to get on and build the hospital.
In your view, would that amount to a material variation to the requirements that we've seen in the invitation to participate in dialogue?
I don't know that I'm in a position to answer that one.
Thank you. I could ask you to have your statement in front of you again, please. This time, bundle 13, page 216, paragraph 121. Do you see a paragraph beginning, I would have reviewed?
Yes.
I would have reviewed the RDS provided by IHSL at FC, along with Fiona Hall-Crowe in relation to operational functionality, i.e. not in relation to the M&E environmental data. I would have relied on MOTS as our technical advisors to review the RDS in relation to environmental data and flag any issues with the project team. MOTS needed clinical input in relation to any issues with the RDS. They would flag this with myself or Fiona Hall-Crowe. See that?
Yes.
Can you just explain who's Fiona Hall-Crowe and what's her involvement in it?
So Fiona Hall-Crowe was one of the project managers in the team. She is a nurse by background, and she had been involved in the project prior to me joining the project.
We've looked at the ITP, said there had to be certain room data sheets provided as part of a tender bid, with the remainder to follow by financial close. And you say that you're undertaking a broad review of the room data sheets. Why are you undertaking a review of the room data sheet?
We were looking at it from an operational functionality point of view, so to ensure that the activities within the room were relevant.
But you mentioned that your expectation was that McDonald would also be conducting a review of the room data sheets.
Yes.
And in terms of that review, was that a review of all of the room data, or was that just a review of some of the room data sheet?
From my perspective, I thought they were reviewing all of them. Certainly, I could see that they potentially wouldn't, if there was a single bedroom in a ward, they wouldn't necessarily review all of the room data sheets for all 10 single bedrooms, because they should be the same. But yes, I would expect that they are reviewing majority.
Again, the inquiry will hear evidence from witnesses from Mott MacDonald at a later stage. But as I understand their position from various witness statements, is they were undertaking what they refer to as a sample review. They were just reviewing samples. Do you remember having any discussions about whether that would be the approach Mott MacDonald would adopt at that time in the project?
I certainly don't recall any discussions about that.
I could ask you to look within bundle 5, please. To page 885. This is the contract that actually agreed between NHS Lothian and IHSL. Bundle 5, page 800. You see a list of key rooms.
Yes.
If we just take some examples, there's B1609, there's 4 beds, low acuity. Then 2 lines down, B140101, single bed cubicle isolation. A couple down, B160902, 4 beds, high acuity. These are described as key rooms. Do you remember how the key rooms were identified and what function they had?
Yes, so the key rooms were rooms that we identified as having specialist requirements, whereas the generic rooms were common rooms that happened at least 4 times in the building. So it was to differentiate, so they were more specialist type rooms.
And in terms of room data sheets being produced by IHSL for these key rooms, was your understanding that they would be reviewed by Mott MacDonald?
Yes.
If we could perhaps just, for fairness, look to those room data sheets, still within bundle 5, if we go to page 1010, please. You see in the top right hand corner, this is B160901.
Yes.
And we see a range of environmental parameters for this room of 4 beds, low acuity. Just as an example, with winter temperature, summer temperature, then mechanical ventilation supply and mechanical ventilation extract. And we see in the requirements section 4.0 and positive, is that correct?
Yes.
Then if we look to page 1030, this is the room data sheet for B160902. Bundle 5, page 1030. that in the top right-hand corner, B160902. This time it's a 4-bed, high acuity. Again, we see the winter temperature.
Mr. McGregor, could I take the opportunity just for my own benefit here? We're looking at an example of a room data sheet.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, other than the descriptor 4 beds high acuity, am I right in thinking there is no narrative explaining what 4 beds high acuity means? In other words, tell me what, or Ms. MacKenzie may be in a better position to do that. The room data sheet is where a translation into air, lighting, noise, and safety specifications of fairly brief descriptor, 4 beds high acuity. Understanding.
That's correct. So these are the corresponding room data sheets for the key rooms that we looked at within bundle 5 at page 885.
Yep. So someone coming to it fresh either is assumed to know what 4 beds high acuity means, or is not concerned with that detail, but is only concerned with the specification.
Yes, because they've got the descriptor in the top right-hand corner, the code, the B1609.
Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
So we're looking in bundle 5, just to look at the 3 examples that B1609, key rooms, 4 beds high. And we see in the body of the document air temperature, summer temperature, and then mechanical ventilation, both the supply and extract, with the values being 4 and positive. That. And then the third example, if we looked at to page 1004, this time top right hand, B1401 is a single bed cubicle. See the values: winter temperature, summer temperature, and the mechanical ventilation supply and mechanical ventilation extract. In the requirements section, we see 4. See that?
Yes.
We can put those documents to one side. I'd like to move on and ask you about something else now, please.
I suppose just it might be helpful to Lord Brodie to pick up on the room data sheet, actually how we identify them, and the bidders as well would identify them as there's a room number there. So it says 1B1039. So B1 relates to critical care. So the bidder would find out more information from the clinical output specification.
Right. So I'll just maybe, as it were, take that by dictation. So the first point is that each of these rooms has a specific
room number. So room number. So it basically, so for critical care, it's 1. So that means it's on floor 1. B1 is the department critical care, and then the room number then relates. So I can't remember the room number that was on that room data sheet, but if it was 039, and then it would say that was 4 bed, low acuity. So
if anyone wanted to understand what 4 beds high acuity or acuity meant. The reference document would be clinical output specification, which would define term used. In other words, would that define what is meant by 4-bed high acuity?
Yes, it would say what was happening in that
Right.
area.
And the
yes.
definition say what is happening.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That was what I was less effectively exploring. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. I just wanted to move on to ask you about a different issue. So within your statement, you mention a concept of healthcare associated infection system for controlling risk in the built environment, which the inquiry seen referred to often by its acronym HAI Scribe. Could you just explain to the inquiry, what is HAI Scribe? What's the system designed for?
So HAI Scribe is used for any construction. So either that being you are within an existing hospital doing building works, or you're building a new hospital, and it's to identify it's a risk management tool. So it's to identify any risks in relation to the building works and how those risks can either be avoided or mitigated. And there's 4 different stages that you use depending on the type of project. So a project of this scale would go through all 4 stages of an HAI Scribe at different times in the project.
And who would undertake the report?
So again, it depends at what stage you're doing, but infection prevention and control would always be there. For a project again of this scale, then you would there would be people from the project team, and there would be people from the bidder team.
In the period after IHSL was appointed as preferred bidder, do you recall there being any HAI Scribe reports produced?
Yes, there were.
Now, we'll come on and look at that, but just a level of generality, can you explain what's happening in terms of HAI Scribe reporting at that point, the point from preferred bidder to financial close?
At that point, there would be an HAI Scribe Stage 3 undertaken, which is prior to construction starting. And you have to obviously do that before the construction. There were, from memory, there was at least 2 that were undertaken, because there was one undertaken for the actual building of the new hospital, but also for the works when there was going to be the join into the existing Royal Infirmary. So a different HAI Scribe had to be undertaken for that. And then prior to building as such becoming operational, you do a final HAI Scribe at stage 4.
And what type of risks was the system and report aimed at trying to identify?
It ranges. It's a wide range. There's a series of questions that are asked, and you respond to them. So it varies from things like, are there sufficient clinical wash-hand basins, to hand sanitisers to, it does ask, some of them ask some ventilation questions.
And in terms of the stage 3 report that we're talking about for this project in the period from preferred bidder being appointed, financial close, do you remember the HAI scribe reporting identifying any specific problems with the ventilation system?
There was a query about the pressure in single bedrooms were highlighted as needing further clarity.
If we could just look to that HAI scribe report then, within bundle 10, volume 1, if we could look to page 283. In the top left-hand corner, healthcare associated infection system for control of risk in the built environment, HAI scribe. For the project, the RHSC and DCN re-provision project in Little France, and it's dated the 19th of November 2014. If we then look on to page 285, see section 2 consultation.
Yes.
And we see that in terms of the department, there's reference to the clinical director, Janice MacKenzie. Do you remember being consulted on this HAI scribe report?
I remember being present, yes, because the people, in effect, it's a meeting going through the risk assessment.
Okay. So that it's called the HAI scribe system, but there's a meeting where matters are discussed and then the report's produced. Is that correct?
Yes. So you basically go through the questions, complete it whilst you're in the meeting, and then the report is formally.
If we look on to page 286, entry 2.2. Entry 2.2 states, is the ventilation system design fit for purpose, given the potential for infection spread via ventilation system? See that?
Yes.
And that's ticked as no. Was that a matter of concern at this point in the project in November 2014 that the ventilation system was described as not being fit for purpose?
I think the kind of, yes, there was concern about it. I think at the time of the meeting, from my recollection, the query was raised and it couldn't be answered at the meeting. So therefore, at the actual meeting, we had to say, score it as a no. We didn't have the answer to the question. So yes, it was a concern at the time, but we didn't have the information to know whether or not it was an issue or not at that time.
Because the reasoning given at paragraph 2.2 is some concern has been raised in relation to a potential issue with ventilation with regard to negative stroke balance pressure in single bedroom, awaiting drawings, further information to really understand if there is a risk stroke issue. See that?
Yes.
Can you just explain your understanding of what was the problem with the negative balance pressure in the single bedrooms?
So I don't recall who raised this as an issue. I would expect it would either have been infection prevention control or Mott's technical advisor who was there. But it was, I suppose we were wanting clarity that the standard single bedrooms did have negative balance pressure, which, as I understand, is what it says in SHTMO 301 is required. So we wanted confirmation that that was the case.
And just so I'm absolutely clear, are we talking about single bedrooms in a general ward, or are we talking about single bedrooms in critical care wards, or all single bedrooms in the hospital?
No, From my recollection, we were talking about what we would deem as standard single rooms, so not in critical care.
And it says awaiting drawings and further information to really understand if there's a risk or an issue. At this point, you're in late November 24, and as I understand it, financial close takes place in February of 2050. You're a few months out from close. Was this risk issue that had been identified, was that resolved before financial close?
From my recollection, it wasn't resolved. We did get the drawings and were told that in fact the rooms were positive pressure, which was obviously not acceptable. And we had gone back to IHSL to tell them that was the case and that they had to comply with SHTMO 301, and therefore, as far as I can recall, the understanding was that they knew that and that was going to happen.
I just want to explore that a bit more. So at this point in November 20, the ventilation system design is not fit for purpose, and that issue isn't resolved before a contract signed with IHSL. Why did the NHS go then consider that was appropriate? Include the contract?
In all honesty, I can't answer that question. I think there was, at the time of moving to financial close, there were lots of discussions going on about what could be resolved and would therefore go into the RDD process, which this obviously would.
And whenever you say that the RDD process, what do you mean by
that? So that is the reviewable design data. So that after financial close, we were reviewing a lot of design proposals, drawings, etc., and signing them off from an operational functionality perspective or giving comments back to IHSL?
But just again, so I'm understanding you, this issue with the ventilation system not being fit for purpose, that's resolved by that issue becoming reviewable design data and
Yeah.
within your statement, and we'll come on to look at this, you address what you describe as a number of outstanding issues as at financial close. Perhaps if we just turn that up, it's in bundle 13, page 218, ends at paragraph 131 and goes into paragraph 132. See paragraph 131, in my view, this does resolve the specific query. In my view, that does resolve the specific, i.e. we responded to the request for information by IHSL in relation to the pressure issue as we agreed to do at the HEI scribe meeting on 13th. I was aware that there were some design issues that were unresolved at financial close, accordingly were subject to the reviewable design data process. Part of my role as clinical director to engage the clinicians during the RDD process to review the design. And then paragraph 132, I have been asked whether I would have been concerned in my role as clinical director at the number of issues that were not resolved by February 2015. And the answer is yes, because the expectation was that those were meant to have been resolved by financial close. Can you just expand a little on what were these outstanding issues and what were the concerns that you had?
I mean, I don't recall the detail of all of the design issues that were still outstanding. There obviously, as we've spoken about previously, the room data sheets we didn't have all of them. There were still outstanding issues in some of the architectural design, the specifics of which at this point I don't recall. But certainly there were enough of issues being raised as not being resolved to be of concern.
And were certain of those issues captured in the board's comments that got put into the contract?
As far as I'm aware, yeah.
If we could perhaps just go back to the contracts, that's bundle 5. Go to page 869, please, first. You see the bold heading, Part 5, non-approved project code proposals, design data comments. Then the second full paragraph, these comments shall be incorporated in relevant item of design data, which shall primarily relate to drawings accompanying the relevant project code proposals by project code, and the drawings shall be submitted by project code to the board through schedule part 8. See that? So effectively, as I understand it, this is non-agreed issues that are going to form part of reviewable design data after the contract's been signed. If we could look on then, please, to page 880. See on page 880, there's the box with environmental matrix. As project code shall update the environmental matrix to reflect the following board comments. And if we look to the fourth bullet point, the wording beginning detailed proposal awaited on bedroom ventilation.
Yes.
So detailed proposal awaited on bedroom ventilation, balance stroke negative pressure relative to corridor. See that?
Yes.
So is that effectively the issue that was highlighted in the HAI scribe report and it's unresolved at the point the contract's signed?
Yes.
And put into this reviewable design data process to be resolved after financial close?
Yes.
If I could ask you to have in front of you, please, within bundle 12, volume 2, page 1052. Bundle 12, volume 2, page 1000. This is a set of minutes for a project management group meeting held on the 1st of October 2014. This isn't a meeting that you're present at, but it's simply one entry that for your views on. We look over the page onto page 1853. Number 2.2 in the top left-hand corner. The action point here is Schedule Part 6, Section 3, BCR's subsection D and E, reissued by the board, where agreed, will incorporate correction to drafting errors, note on BMC derogations list. And then it's really the next sentence. It says, review of RDS by Janice MacKenzie to be included, NB only anticipated change to subsections A to C in relation to bus stop index. Do you know what's being referred to there by the review of RDS by Janice MacKenzie?
I think looking at the date of the meeting, I think that relates to the IHSL had provided us with a list of room data sheets that they were going to provide for financial close, and myself and others in the team were asked to review that to see if we felt there should be any additional rooms that required room data sheets for financial close. So that's the only thing I was kind of involved in.
And what happened? Was there a list provided, and did you review that list?
So there was a list provided, which from memory was all of the key and generic rooms. There was no other additional rooms, and we put forward a small number of other additional rooms that we thought it would be helpful to have room data sheets for.
I think the final issue that I wish to raise with you at this stage is, as the inquiry understands it, NHS Lothian accepts that there were some errors in the environmental matrix, spreadsheet errors, that resulted in the hospital not opening on time and remedial works having to be carried out thereafter. Obviously, you're involved particularly in the procurement stage. Do you have any reflections to offer in terms of whether there were any issues that arose during the procurement stage that perhaps contributed to those issues, and perhaps issues that could, with the benefit of hindsight, be done better?
I think that's quite a difficult question to answer. I'm not sure that I'm best placed for that. I think hindsight is a wonderful thing, and I suppose it is about how something like this wouldn't happen again. And I say I'm not sure that I am best placed to give a response to that, really.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions at the moment. Lord Brodie may have questions, or equally there might be applications from core participants.
I do not have any questions at this time. However, as Mr. McGregor indicated, I would wish to give an opportunity to legal representatives to consider their position, the possibility of answering questions. What I would propose, had we been likely to take up the whole of the morning, I would have taken a coffee break anyway. So what I would propose is that we, as it were, have an earlier coffee break of time available to us. We might sit again at 11:45. We'd ask you, certainly hope you have the option of coffee before then.
Yeah.
I would ask you to be in the witness room at that time. At 11:45, we'll resume, and I would expect any parties who wish to have further questions asked be in a position to tell me of what the position is then. But for the moment, we'll rise and aim to sit again at 11:45. I understand from Mr. McGregor that there is one point of clarification that he has been asked to pursue with Ms. MacKenzie, but otherwise there is no wish to ask additional questions. So on that basis, I would invite Ms. MacKenzie to rejoin us. Hello again.
Hi.
I think there's just one matter which Mr. McGregor will explore with you. I'll ask him to do that. Mr. McGregor.
Thank you. Ms. MacKenzie, there's just one very small point of detail that I would pick up with you. If we could turn up bundle 5, go back to page 1030 that we'd looked at before. This is the room data sheet for B160902. Do you see that in the top right-hand corner?
Yep.
And there was a discussion that you had with Lord Brodie about various activities and how that would be shown. If you look back to page 1029, this is still the activity database sheet for B160902. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then we see various issues listed, so activities and personnel. So we see the activities that in this room there would be clinical hand washing, patient records reviewed and recorded, etc. And then we see the personnel that would be in the room, so 4 times people, 5 times staff, 6 times visitors. See that? So is that setting out some of the types of information in terms of how the room would be used in the room data sheet itself?
Yes, it is, but what I would say is it's probably those are very generic statements. It's not necessarily picking up the specialist elements that would be happening.
So again, just so I'm understanding your evidence, a shorthand summary in the room data sheet, and for all the reasons you explained, there were other documents to try and find out more detail if you required that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. MacKenzie. I don't have any further questions.
And I don't understand that anyone else has either. MacKenzie. So thank you again for your attendance. I'm very appreciative of the fact of giving evidence to the inquiry is not simply a question of turning up for a morning or part of a morning. It involves you, it has involved you in work. And first of all, conscious of that. Secondly, would wish to thank you. You're now free to go.
Yeah.
As I understand the position, we don't have a witness immediately to follow on. We will have a witness, Mr. Stevenson, at 2 o'clock this afternoon. And I take the opportunity, lest I forget later, that we've had to do some rescheduling of witnesses for tomorrow in respect. Mr. Cantley had other obligations to fulfill. I think at one stage it was suggested we would only sit in the afternoon, but Mr. Stilley has accommodated us effectively, and he will be available at 10 o'clock. So lest I forget, we're sitting tomorrow at 10. But for the moment, we will adjourn until 2 o'clock.
Please stand.